Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. If you like scary stories, hit subscribe, like the video, and share with your friends. Thanks. I grew up without much family around. My mom passed away after her parents had cut her off, and my dad was frequently in mental health facilities before he took his own life. The only family I knew of was my dad's brother, my uncle. But one of the few dark family secrets I did know was that my uncle held himself responsible for my dad's death. Because of that, he'd built a cabin in the woods up in Vermont and had been living there alone ever since. I only had a vague idea where the cabin was, and I wasn't interested in reaching out to him. To me, he was as distant as my parents. Truthfully, I also blamed him for my dad's death. Having someone to direct my frustration toward gave me a little peace after a rough, unhappy childhood. Yet, somehow, by the summer of 2016, I had managed to carve out a decent life for myself in the outskirts of Philadelphia. I worked as an assistant manager at a small brewery, had a cozy apartment, and even went on a few dates. It finally felt like I was leaving the past behind. Then, out of nowhere, I received a letter that would change everything. The letter came from a law firm in Montpelier, Vermont. When I saw where it was from, I had a feeling what it might be. Sure enough, it was a notice informing me of my uncle's passing and that his estate was being divided among his remaining family. I had always assumed he didn't have much to leave, and that turned out to be true. But apparently, I'd inherited something. Frustratingly, I'd have to drive to Montpelier to find out what it was. I called the law office, saying I was too busy to drive out, and asked if they could just tell me what I'd been left. The attorney explained that he had no idea. All he had was a key to a safe deposit box in a Montpelier bank. His only instructions were to make sure I opened the box to understand its contents, which he would only receive payment for once I did so. The whole thing sounded like something out of a cheesy mystery novel, and it wasn't until the attorney confirmed his sincerity that I started to take it seriously. Part of me wanted nothing to do with it. I didn't want to reopen old wounds and dig up a past I'd worked hard to bury. But if there was money involved, as shallow as it sounds, I wasn't about to turn it down. So one Friday in mid-July, I took a half-day off work and made the 6-hour drive up to Vermont. It was a pleasant enough drive in the summertime with scenic views, but as I pulled up to the modest law firm of Benson and Gray, an uneasy feeling took over. I'd built up this idea that whatever I'd find would somehow ruin the stability I'd worked so hard to achieve. Meeting the attorney and going to the bank felt surreal, and by the time we were escorted to the room with the deposit boxes, I was nervous beyond reason. When I unlocked the box, I found only a bundle of cash and a sealed letter. The attorney took the money, but when it came time for me to open the letter, I hesitated. Sensing my reluctance, the attorney offered to read it and give me a brief summary. I agreed, thinking it might be easier that way. I watched his expression as he read, waiting for the impact. Instead of an apology or explanation, all the letter contained was a set of numbers, coordinates, I assumed, and 3 simple words: burn it all. The attorney asked if I recognized the coordinates, and I had no idea. A quick online search showed they pointed to a spot in the Green Mountain National Forest. I was fairly sure this was where his cabin was, but what he wanted me to destroy was a complete mystery. In minutes, my reluctance transformed into morbid curiosity. My mind raced with scenarios, each more bizarre and dark than the last. I needed to know if he'd left behind something awful that he wanted erased. On the drive back, I peppered the attorney with questions about my uncle's passing. He said my uncle had driven himself to the hospital shortly before he died, after setting up the deposit box months earlier. No one had been inside that cabin but him. Before I left, I asked for the attorney's advice. His response was unforgettable. Sometimes, if you don't bury things, they come back to haunt you. He was right. I couldn't keep losing sleep over this. I decided to honor my uncle's final request by going out there, burning whatever he left behind, and closing the chapter for good. I planned to get a night's rest at a nearby hotel and head out in the morning. But by 2 a.m., I was too restless to sleep, so I mapped out the route on my phone. As dawn broke, I gathered a few supplies, including a gas can and matches, then set off for the forest. The entire drive, those words, "burn it all," echoed in my mind. I was consumed with the need to see what lay hidden there, to understand how he'd been living. When I reached the closest parking lot, I began the hike toward the coordinates. The forest felt strange as I walked, and I soon noticed clusters of unusual mushrooms, so frequent it was unsettling. About halfway to my destination, I stumbled upon a strange pile of what looked like ground meat mixed with brain tissue, but it was actually a type of fungus known as brain mushroom. The sight was eerie, and as I ventured deeper, I encountered another type, bleeding mushrooms that looked like fresh, bloody wounds. The closer I got to the cabin, the more these fungi littered the forest floor. The smell hit me before I saw the cabin, a sickeningly sweet stench, like decaying meat. When I finally caught sight of the dilapidated structure through the trees, I nearly gagged. The cabin was covered in those mushrooms, and the closer I got, the more repulsive the odor became. Exhausted, I just wanted to get it over with, so I pulled the gas can from my bag. But before I doused the place, I had a thought. What exactly was causing that smell? Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to peek inside. The cabin interior was a nightmare. A swampy humidity clung to the air, and the entire space was overgrown with fungus. The stove held a huge pot, still filled with a stew of some kind, and tubes were connected to it, running vapor through the cabin, probably creating that unbearable smell. Books were scattered across the floor, and a chalkboard displayed strange symbols. Within seconds, my eyes began to water, and I had to retreat to avoid fainting. After catching my breath, I soaked the outside of the cabin in gasoline and lit a match. As the flames roared, I could swear I heard something shriek, though I told myself it was just the damp wood burning. I drove home with more questions than I'd had before, but I felt relieved. If there was any dark secret in that cabin, I was glad it was gone. I never saw anything about a forest fire in the news, and I can't help but wonder if someone else had an interest in keeping that place quiet. I try not to dwell on it too much. I've moved on with my life, and I even have a steady girlfriend now who I talk about a future with. And if you ever find yourself near those woods, pay attention to the mushrooms. If you start seeing too many, it might be a sign to turn around and go back the way you came. There comes a moment, at least once in life, when you experience true dread. It's the kind of fear that tightens your chest with a mix of fire and ice, where every breath feels like it stretches time, and your stomach not so tight it presses a silent scream into your throat. Maybe you try to run, maybe you freeze, or maybe you even attempt to fight. For those who have known this terror, it carves so deeply into you that it alters something in your soul. That said, let me take you back to December 14th, 2008. I grew up in a devoutly religious household. At that time, I was still young and easily influenced. With all the teachings about heaven, angels, and the threat of hell's eternal flames, it's a lot for a 10-year-old to process. Anyway, my family and I flew out to Montana, where we rented a cabin high up in the mountains, surrounded by deep woods and heavy snowfall. My dad even had to bring a portable oxygen tank due to the altitude. It was a secluded place with only one other cabin about 2 acres away, barely visible through the trees covered in snow. That first night was enjoyable. We made a fire, toasted marshmallows, and popped popcorn on long sticks. My younger siblings and I even built a snowman. Inside, the cabin had an open floor plan with a second-floor loft railing, where there were 2 single beds. Underneath the stairs, my dad set up his bed. We had a tiny TV and an old blue couch that smelled faintly of maple syrup. I slept on the left twin bed, closest to the edge, while my 7-year-old sister, Hannah, took the right, safer bed farther from the drop. Our baby sister, Rosie, was only 3, so she slept downstairs with our dad. That night, I slept well. Likely the last truly good night's sleep I've had since then, and I'm 24 now. But in the early hours of the next morning, it started. I was jolted awake by an odd tapping sound. It wasn't like a light knock. It was a heavy, scratchy tapping, like claws rapping against the wooden floor. At first, I thought it might be my dad. We were, after all, in the mountains, and I knew bears lived nearby. But I was wrong. That raspy sound kept coming, making me stay still in bed. I had a habit of sleeping with a pillow over my head, so I felt somewhat hidden. Gathering my courage, I peered through the gap between my pillow and the bed, looking toward the open loft railing. From where I lay, I could see the edge of the loft, the straight drop down to the living room and the tiny kitchen below. There was a dark shape near the edge, something like a shadow, and it seemed to be gripping the loft ledge, tapping its fingers with extra joints. I froze. Fear chilled me, locking me in place. No, I whispered in my mind. It can't be. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Dawn would come soon. I always woke up around 7 a.m. I just had to make it till then. I kept telling myself monsters couldn't be real. I repeated verses and prayers, hoping they'd make it go away. After what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, I sensed the air shift, relaxing just a bit. Braving a peek, I noticed that the shadowy hand was gone. Relieved, I turned to face the wall, where there was a small, dark nightstand with an old oil lamp. Behind it, barely visible, was a tiny door, almost like a storage hatch. This was years before I ever saw Coraline, but the resemblance is uncanny. The door was a weathered brown, with an almost scorched look to it. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. Later, when the sun finally rose, I mentioned the small door to my dad. He checked it out and found it was just a storage closet with a few gallons of water and firewood. But that night, the real terror began. Uneasy from the previous experience, I asked my dad to keep a light on. Instead, he built a strong fire and put up the chain guard. The fire glowed brightly for hours, casting shadows up the high cabin walls, and I spent more time watching them than actually sleeping. Eventually, the flames dimmed, leaving only faint embers. Then the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't behind me. It came from inside the tiny door. I thought it might just be the wind, perhaps a branch brushing the roof. But then silence fell. Slowly, I looked toward the door. My heart stopped when I saw long, thin fingers sliding out from the gap, curling around the frame. The door started shaking, followed by a harsh scraping sound, loud enough to make my sister stir. The fire went out, plunging the room into darkness. A bang shook the door. My body stiffened in terror, every muscle locked. The banging continued, each strike vibrating through the air. My sister Hannah woke up and whispered, "Stop it!" But the door kept rattling. She called my name, but I stayed silent, paralyzed with fear. Something had moved onto my bed, and she could see it. Whatever it was, it had come from the small closet by my side. Tears spilled down my cheeks, but I dared not open my eyes again. The banging grew more frantic, louder, until it was almost deafening, as if something was trying to force its way through. I started reciting verses under my breath, praying it would leave. Then, heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs, and my dad's voice called out. The banging stopped, but I could still feel something at the end of my bed. Its claws caught in my blanket, tugging slightly. Suddenly, with a final, forceful bang, the door swung open. I dared to look and was met by two hollow, dark eyes staring back, sunken into a face so pale it seemed lifeless. Whatever it was, it felt like pure evil, like it came from a place where no light could reach. The creature leaned back and vanished across the room in a blur. A loud scuffle erupted as my dad rushed up the stairs, wrestling with something invisible in the dimness. The front door crashed open as the thing vanished into the night. In the aftermath, my sisters and I huddled together, clutching blankets and supplies, waiting for help. The snowfall had blocked the road, delaying the rescue team, who had to plow their way through. When they finally arrived, they carried my dad out to safety, while my sisters and I clung to each other, still frozen in shock. We never speak of that cabin or what happened that night. Today, my beliefs have changed, but I'll never forget those cold eyes in the dark. It was late fall when I decided to take my dog, Max, to my old cabin in the woods. I hadn't been there in years, and the idea of spending a weekend away from the noise of the city felt just right. The air was cool, and the leaves crunched under my feet as I walked to the cabin, a small, worn-down building hidden among tall pine trees. Max wagged his tail and sniffed every inch of the ground, excited to be outside in the wild. Once inside, I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace. The warm light flickered around the room, making it feel cozy and pushing away the chill in the air. I unpacked my things and settled in, listening to the sounds of the forest. It felt peaceful until the sun disappeared. As darkness wrapped around the cabin, the friendly sounds of nature turned strange and unsettling. The wind whistled through the trees, and I heard branches crack now and then. Max seemed restless. He lay by the fire, his ears standing tall, watching the shadows shift. I tried to shake off my own worries, telling myself it was just the woods. But then I heard something, a low sound coming from outside, almost like a growl. My heart began to race. I glanced at Max, who was now standing on alert, his fur raised. I could feel his anxiety, and it made me uneasy. I moved to the window and looked outside, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. I took a deep breath and turned back to the fire, trying to calm myself. The growling kept going, and it sounded closer now. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the cabin door, hoping to spot a deer or maybe even a bear. I stepped outside with Max right beside me. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dark, showing only trees and bushes. Then I heard it again, right behind me. I swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just the pounding of my own heart. Suddenly, Max started barking and growling deeply. I turned to him, and before I could react, I heard a heavy thud followed by rustling in the bushes. Fear shot through me as I realized whatever was out there was very close now. I called Max back, and we rushed inside, slamming the door behind us. I locked it and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I could hear something outside now, sniffing and moving around the cabin. Felt like it was watching us. My mind raced, thinking of what I might be facing. The growls turned into low, rumbling sounds, almost like a warning. In that moment, I knew I had to do something. I grabbed a heavy log from the fireplace, not sure if it would help, but feeling like I had no other choice. The noises continued, and I could see shadows moving outside the windows. Max was on high alert, ready to protect me. I realized we couldn't stay in the cabin forever. I had to come up with a plan. Finally, the noises stopped. It felt like a long time had passed, but I didn't dare open the door. After a while, I heard something shuffle away. Slowly, I crept to the window and peeked out. There was nothing, just the silence of the forest. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, then opened the cabin door carefully. Max and I stepped outside, staying close together. The air felt thick, but it was quiet. I felt a bit of relief wash over me, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After a restless night, dawn broke, bringing light back to the cabin. I stepped outside to see if I could find any signs of what had been lurking around. As the sunlight filtered through the trees, I noticed something in the underbrush, a set of large tracks leading away from the cabin. They didn't belong to a bear or any animal I recognized. Panic gripped me again, but I knew I had to leave. I packed up quickly, keeping Max close by my side. As we drove away, the feeling of dread stuck with me. I glanced back at the cabin, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something watching us from the edge of the trees. It was a shadow, dark and still, hidden among the branches. I pressed the gas pedal harder, eager to put that old cabin far behind me. I promised myself I'd never return to that place. Whatever had been out there was still in those woods, and I had no intention of finding out what it was. As we drove away, I couldn't help but feel that something was following us, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance. The memory of that night would haunt me forever, a chilling reminder of the danger hiding in the silence of the woods. Even now, as I sit at home, I often catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those dark eyes watching me from the trees, waiting for the moment I might let my guard down. I had always wanted to spend a weekend in a quiet cabin in the woods. So when I finally found one to rent, I jumped at the chance. This cabin was deep in the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by tall trees and an eerie silence that felt both peaceful and unsettling. I arrived just as the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the ground. After I unpacked my bags, I decided to explore the area. The air was cool, and I could smell the fresh pine. I walked along a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The trees were thick, and I could hear the faint sound of a stream nearby. I enjoyed the quiet until I noticed something strange, a soft, rhythmic thumping sound. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it echoed through the trees. My curiosity got the best of me, so I followed the sound. The further I went, the louder it became. It felt like something was out there, hiding among the trees, but I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping in. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the fading light. As night fell, I made my way back to the cabin. I tried to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. I locked the door behind me, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. I settled in for the night, lit a fire, and curled up on the couch with a book. But the rhythmic thumping returned, more pronounced now. It was too strange to be anything natural, and my heart started to race. I decided I had to find out what it was. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside into the chilly night. The woods were silent now, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my feet. I walked cautiously toward the direction of the noise. Each step felt heavy, and the beam of my flashlight flickered in the dark. As I got closer, I realized the sound was coming from an old, run-down shed at the edge of the property. It was hidden by overgrown bushes, as if it didn't want to be found. My stomach twisted with fear, but I needed to know what was causing that thumping. I approached the shed, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing like a warning. Inside, I saw old tools scattered on the floor, but the thumping continued, louder now. It was coming from behind a wall of stacked crates. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the crates aside and uncovered a trapdoor. The thumping was unmistakable now. Someone was definitely down there. Panic surged through me. I knew I should leave, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I opened the trapdoor, revealing a dark staircase that led down into the unknown. The thumping stopped, and an eerie silence surrounded me. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know what was happening. Slowly, I climbed down the stairs, my flashlight lighting the narrow steps. At the bottom, I found a small room with dirty walls and an old, rusty chair in the center. Strapped to the chair was a man, looking disheveled and wild-eyed. His clothes were torn, and he looked like he had been trapped there for days. He was alive, but barely. Realizing the danger I was in, I quickly backed away, the weight of what I had just discovered crashing down on me. I had stumbled into something horrifying, something that had no place in my peaceful cabin getaway. I rushed back up the stairs and slammed the trapdoor shut, my heart pounding like a drum. I didn't stop to grab my things. I fled the shed and raced back to my car, adrenaline pushing me forward. I drove away, the dark woods disappearing in my rearview mirror, but the chilling thought of what I had seen lingered in my mind. The horror of that night wouldn't let me go. I couldn't shake the image of that man's terrified eyes. Had he been a victim? Had someone done this to him? I felt sick with fear, knowing that I had narrowly escaped whatever darkness lurked in those woods. As I sped down the winding road, my mind raced. I thought of all the times I had imagined adventure in the wild, but I never expected to find such a nightmare. Some secrets, I realized, should stay hidden. I wouldn't just be leaving that cabin behind. I would be leaving a part of myself there, haunted by the idea that someone might still be trapped in that shed, and that whatever had captured him could be watching me from the shadows. Driving through the night, I promised myself I would never return. Yet, as the miles stretched on, the weight of that cabin, the trapdoor, and the sound that had drawn me impressed heavy on my chest. I couldn't escape the feeling that even though I had left the cabin, the darkness I had uncovered would follow me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment to claim me too. The old cabin stood at the edge of the woods, hidden by thick trees and vines that wrapped around its worn walls. It was my grandmother's place, a safe haven for her and a fun place for me when I was a kid. Now it felt like a grave. After she died, the family decided to sell the cabin, but I wanted to visit one last time. I drove out on a Friday evening, the sun sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows on the dirt road. The air felt heavy with memories of the summers the first spent there. I parked and stepped inside, the familiar smell of wood and dust welcoming me back. The living room hadn't changed, with her old quilt draped over the faded couch. As I walked through the cabin, I felt a strange chill. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the cool evening air. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the back room where my grandmother used to keep her belongings. It was dark, and the flashlight flickered as I moved it around the room. Suddenly, I noticed something on the floor, half hidden under the bed. It was a small box, covered in dust. Curious, I knelt down and pulled it out. Inside, I found old letters and photographs. They were filled with memories of her life before I was born. As I read through them, I felt a deep sadness wash over me. I missed her more than I had realized. But then I spotted something odd. At the bottom of the box lay a small, torn diary. The last entry was dated just a week before she died. My heart raced as I opened it. The writing was shaky, filled with fear. She wrote about someone watching her, someone she felt was coming for her. I tried to dismiss it as old age paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As night fell, I decided to stay in the cabin for the night. I lit a small fire in the fireplace, trying to fill the space with warmth. I wrapped myself in her quilt and tried to sleep, but every sound made me jump. The wind howled outside, and I kept hearing noises from the woods. They were faint, but it felt like someone was out there, watching me. I lay awake, staring at the shadows on the walls, until I finally drifted into a restless sleep. A few hours later, I was jolted awake by a loud crash outside. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and hurried to the window. I pointed it towards the noise and saw something move in the darkness. Something large and dark. Fear surged through me, a gut feeling telling me to get out. I quickly packed my things, my hands shaking. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a soft creaking sound from the back of the cabin. I froze, straining to listen. It was the door to my grandmother's old bedroom. I could see a shadow moving inside. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but I felt that presence, just as she had described in her diary. Panicking, I ran to the front door and flung it open, racing into the cold night. I didn't look back as I jumped into my car and sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin faded behind me, swallowed by the darkness of the trees. As I drove away, I realized that her fears weren't just the ramblings of an old woman. There was something out there, something that had lingered long after she had passed. A chill crept over me as I thought about her last few months. That cabin had been a place of good memories, but now it felt cursed, like a warning I couldn't ignore. I knew I couldn't go back. That place held too much danger. I drove on, relieved to be away from the cabin, but a nagging thought followed me. Had I left something behind? Something that would come looking for me? As I made my way down the dark road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The trees swayed gently, but it felt like they were leaning in closer, watching me. I shivered, recalling the shadow I saw in the window. Then, I heard a whisper on the wind, a soft voice calling my name, a reminder of the fear my grandmother had felt. My heart raced as I stepped on the gas, desperate to put distance between myself and that cabin. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed. It was as if the very woods had come alive, wanting to pull me back into their depths, where secrets lay buried, waiting to be unearthed. And as I drove into the night, I couldn't shake the thought that some things should never be disturbed. I had left her behind, but whatever watched from the shadows was still out there, waiting for its chance. I had just started a new job at a tech company when my boss invited me to his cabin in the woods for a weekend trip with a few coworkers. I was excited about the chance to get to know the team better and escape the city for a while. The cabin was deep in the forest, surrounded by tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. We arrived on a Friday evening, and the cabin looked old but cozy. The wooden floors creaked under my feet, and the smell of pine filled the air. After settling in, we lit a fire in the big stone fireplace and enjoyed some snacks. Laughter and light chatter filled the room as we shared stories. But there was a strange tension in the air, as if we all knew we were far away from help. The first night was quiet enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around midnight, I woke up to a rustling sound outside my window. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a deer or some other animal. But when I heard a soft thud followed by heavy breathing, my heart started to race. I quietly got out of bed and peeked through the curtains. What I saw made my stomach drop. A dark figure was moving around the property, too big to be an animal. It was hard to see in the dim light, but it looked like a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. My instinct told me to stay quiet and not wake anyone else. I slipped back into bed, trying to convince myself I was just imagining things. The next morning, I told my boss and the others about my unease, but they laughed it off, saying it was probably just a local looking for firewood. I tried to enjoy the day, hiking and exploring the nearby trails, but I kept glancing back at the cabin, half expecting to see that figure again. As night fell, the feeling of being watched returned. We gathered for dinner, but my mind was racing with thoughts. Afterward, I decided to take a short walk outside to clear my head. The air was cold, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my feet and the wind whispering through the trees. Suddenly, I heard a branch snap behind me. I turned around, my heart racing, but saw nothing. Just as I was about to head back inside, I caught a glimpse of that dark figure again, this time much closer to the cabin. My gut twisted in fear, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I ran back inside and locked the door behind me. I told everyone what I had seen, and this time they could see the fear in my eyes. My boss suggested we all stay together for the night, so we gathered in the living room, keeping the fire burning brightly. As the hours passed, the tension grew thicker. We heard faint noises outside, the sound of something dragging across the ground. My boss got up to check the windows, but he didn't see anything strange. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I crept to the front door and peeked outside. That's when I noticed the cabin door slightly open. Panic surged through me. I quietly backed away and whispered for everyone to be quiet. We all held our breaths as the noise continued, now accompanied by a low, rumbling sound. The fear was heavy in the air. My boss grabbed a heavy flashlight and moved toward the door. We followed closely, hearts pounding like drums. He swung the door open and we all gasped. The area around the cabin was covered in broken branches and disturbed dirt, as if someone had been looking for something. But then we saw it. A set of large boot prints leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the dark woods. My boss quickly closed the door and locked it tight. We stayed awake, taking turns watching through the windows until dawn broke. When the first light shone through the trees, we dared to step outside. The prints were still visible, leading deeper into the forest. We packed our things quickly, adrenaline pumping through our veins. My boss decided we should leave right away. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin, feeling a mix of relief and dread. Whatever had been out there was still in those woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching us. When I got home, I tried to push the memories of the weekend away, but they haunted me. The unsettling feeling lingered, reminding me that not all places in the woods are safe. I learned that some things are better left hidden, and I never accepted another invitation to that cabin again. As the days passed, I kept thinking about that figure. I wondered who or what it was and if it was still out there. Every rustle in the bushes or creak of the floorboards sent chills through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it knew my name, that it was waiting for me to return. Months later, I heard a rumor about disappearances in the woods near the cabin. Locals talked about a figure that lurked in the shadows, watching unsuspecting campers. The stories chilled me to the bone, and I realized I had been lucky to escape. I still find myself looking over my shoulder when I walk outside at night, afraid of what might be watching from the darkness. Some things are best left alone, and I can only hope that whatever was out there remains hidden. Because now, I know the woods hold secrets that can't be explained, and one day, I might not be so lucky. The rain slammed against the cabin roof, making a steady sound that matched the beating of my heart. I had come to this remote cabin to escape the chaos of my life, looking for peace and quiet. The trees around me swayed heavily in the storm, their shadows dancing across the windows. I sat in front of the fireplace, listening to the crackle of the logs, staring out into the dark woods. As night fell, the wind howled, and I could feel the cold creeping into the cabin. I wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The flickering light from the fire created strange shadows, and every creak of the woods seemed louder than normal. I tried to push my fear away, reminding myself that I was alone and safe inside these walls. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from outside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch breaking, but that didn't ease my anxiety. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed the flashlight from the table. Stepping outside, I felt the cold rain soak me right away. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, lighting up the nearby trees. My heart raced as I looked around, half expecting to see something hiding in the shadows. Nothing, just the wet ground and the distant rumble of thunder. As I turned back toward the cabin, I heard another noise, a rustling sound coming from the woods. My breath quickened, and I gripped the flashlight tighter. I aimed it toward the noise, but all I could see were the rain-soaked bushes moving a little, as if something was pushing through them. A wave of fear washed over me. I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. My heart pounded as I leaned against the door, trying to calm down. I reminded myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. But then I heard it again, a soft scratching at the door. I froze. The sound was clear, like something trying to get in. Panic seized me, and I rushed to the window, peering out into the storm. I saw nothing but the relentless rain and shadows. With each passing minute, the scratching grew louder and more urgent. I felt trapped, my mind racing with thoughts. What could it be? I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was not friendly. I stepped away from the window, searching the cabin for anything I could use to protect myself. Suddenly, I heard the door handle jiggling. My heart sank. I stepped back, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, my body tense. I could barely hear the rain over the pounding in my chest. The scratching stopped, and I waited in silence, straining to listen. Then, the noise shifted to the window, and I caught a glimpse of something. A dark shape, maybe a person or an animal. I aimed the flashlight at it, and my heart nearly stopped. It was a man, drenched to the bone, his eyes wide and frantic. I almost opened the door, thinking he might be in trouble. But then I noticed how he stared at me, sizing me up. Something felt wrong. Instead of letting fear take over, I decided to act. I shouted, "What do you want?" I wasn't going to let him in without knowing more. He stepped back, his face changing to something more aggressive, more determined. In that moment, I knew I had to protect myself. I grabbed the iron fire poker from the hearth and held it tight, ready for anything. As he moved closer, I raised the poker, warning him to stay back. I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. He paused, confusion crossing his face, but then he lunged forward. In an instant, I swung the poker with all my strength, hitting his arm. He let out a grunt of pain and staggered back. I seized the chance, rushing to the door and throwing the lock shut. I could hear him cursing outside, but I didn't dare open the door again. I backed away, breathing heavily, feeling both scared and relieved. The rain poured down, drowning out his angry words. After a few moments, I heard him retreat into the woods, the sound of his footsteps fading into the storm. I sat down on the floor, trembling but thankful. I had faced something terrifying and made it through. The cabin, once a quiet escape, had turned into a battleground. As the rain washed away the chaos outside, I realized the night wasn't just about fear. It was about survival. I kept the fire burning bright and stayed alert until dawn. The world outside was quiet now, but I knew I wouldn't look at that cabin the same way again. I had escaped danger, but the memory of that rainy night would haunt me forever. As I sat there, the flickering light from the fire seemed to dance mockingly. It was as if the shadows held secrets, whispers of what had happened outside. And even as dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of gray, I could not shake the feeling that the man would come back. The night had changed me, and I would never truly feel safe in that cabin again. The thought of him lurking in the woods, waiting for his chance, sent a chill down my spine. I realized then that the fear I felt was not just from what had happened, but from what could happen again. I had survived one nightmare, but I couldn't help but wonder, was it really over?